Okay, good morning, everyone, especially in North America. It's early for me on the East Coast to be talking to people, but I think it's particularly early for those of you joining us west of DC. So we really appreciate all of you being here. This is messaging to policymakers, so let's just go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to start off with a seemingly simple question, which is, why should we engage with policymakers? So for starters, just look at some of the headlines. Science and policy are already intertwined. This happens with issues like scientific integrity, federal science funding, and other science legislation, political appointees running science agencies, local science policy issues. And I think the pandemic has really brought a lot of these issues in particular to light. So we have some headlines here from some recent science policy. I think some of these might even be a little out of date now, but it's important for you to be involved in science because it's happening in policy all around us. So another great reason to be involved in science policy is, compared to many other topics, science just doesn't get talked about with policymakers as often as other critical issues. So if you ever have called a congressional office, typically the staffer answering the phone call has a list of common issues that folks are calling in, and they'll make a little check mark next to the number of constituents that are calling in and talking about a certain issue. So common issues like this are healthcare, social security, and education, but science seldom gets brought up. We have a phrase in DC that we like to say, which is, if you're not at the table, you're what's for dinner. And what I mean by that is that if scientists and science supporters aren't speaking up for science policy or for science to policymakers, then no one will. And it'll be considered less important by policymakers and likely means that funding will be cut for science and policymakers won't be stepping up to support science policy legislation. So this is the second part of our workshop series. Last week, we talked about Science Policy 101. So this was a quick overview. This was largely focused on US politics. So if you're from outside of the US, you might be able to skip this one and just get jumped into the messaging with us today. But in that session, we talked about Congress 101, which was how bills become laws, the makeup of Congress in the US, as well as some key science committees. We talked about the federal budget and appropriations, which is just how the government's pocketbook works. And we did a review of some key science policy legislation. So again, if you're in the US, we would really encourage you to go back and look at this session to get a refresher on some of these topics. But we will go to our panelists today. Shane, can you skip forward a couple of slides? There we go. Right, thank you so much. So I'm going to introduce our panelists today. So my name is Caitlin Bergstrom. I am our public affairs analyst at AGU. I've been with AGU for about 1.5 years. I have a background in entomology and environmental science, and I do a lot of our grassroots engagement and digital engagement at AGU. So let the other panelists introduce themselves.
Morning, everyone. My name's Stephen Albright. I am one of AGU's public affairs interns for the fall, so I've only been with AGU for a couple months. I just finished my PhD in physics, and today I'll be talking about some of the advocacy efforts I've taken while I was a graduate student.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Webster, and I'm program manager for AGU's public affairs team. And in my role, I lead our Hill outreach strategy and help to also set our administrative strategy as well.
Okay, next slide. We're going to talk briefly just about our roadmap for today. So we're going to start with deciding on an ask and what is an ask, then go to researching your member of Congress, then crafting your message, and closing with discussing controversial topics. We'll have some dedicated time at the end for Q&A, but if you have questions throughout the session, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we are happy to answer them. So I'm going to kick it off to Brittany to start with what's an ask.
Hi, everyone. So first things first, what's an ask? Basically, an ask is DC lingo for the purpose of your visit. It's what you want the staffer or policymaker to do as a result of your meeting. Something to keep in mind is that if you're attending a meeting as part of a group, you want to make sure your constituent is the one who makes the ask. They are the person in the room with the voting power and the one the staff really want to hear from the most. Additionally, you generally don't want to have more than one ask. Next slide, please. Walking to a meeting and asking for something might seem a little awkward at first, but policymakers and their staff really expect an ask. And if Cheyenne, if you'll, I think, click maybe once or twice to get these graphs moving. Often in a meeting, when you make your ask, it's the first time you'll see a staffer put pen to paper. Most of your policymakers are elected officials, and all of your policymakers are public servants who serve their constituents or their citizens. Hearing from their constituents about what they want and what their priorities are is a key part of a policymaker's job. I want to pause here and ask if you all would type into the chat what you want to talk to your legislators about. Maybe it's a problem or issue you'd like to see addressed. And this could be related to science or your community, or it might even be something as mundane as, you know, the potholes on your street. Some of you guys might remember that current Senator Booker became really popular because he was known as the mayor who would come to your town and fill those potholes. So nothing is really too mundane for some policymakers. So I'm going to keep going, but I really encourage you to type in the chat some of the issues that you might want to talk to your policymakers about. Right now, I'm kind of walking through the Ask worksheet, so we're going to keep coming back to these issues that you want to talk to your policymakers about. And you're not committing to it, it's just for today. So next slide, please. When formulating your ask, make sure it satisfies these three factors. It needs to be specific, actionable, and achievable. If your ask is specific, that really means that in a week, a month, or maybe even 6 months, you'll be able to say, yes, my policymaker did what I asked, or no, they didn't. And to give you an example, it's not enough to ask your policymaker to support science. I've never walked into a congressional office and they told me they didn't support science. So you really need to think about what's an action that they can take to demonstrate that they support science. And a specific ask allows you to hold your policymaker accountable. We'll get into some of these actions, what some of these actions might look like on the next slide. So your ask should also be actionable. So within the policymaker's power and also ripe for action. For example, your member of Congress has no influence over like the curriculum of your local school district, or it's also not a good idea to ask your congressperson to vote on a bill that's already passed Congress. Again, it's no longer ripe for action. And finally, your ask should be achievable. Policymakers have a lot of power, but they're not all powerful. So it's important to remember that although they can be influential, a lone policymaker cannot pass a law by themselves or demand an agency to do something. They can encourage or express concerns, but they can't actually tell an agency what to do, generally speaking. And so given these qualifications for an ask, I want you to think about the problem or issue you typed in the chat box or thinking about, in your head. And I want you to identify kind of what policymaker you might want to talk to. So what level of government, is appropriate to address your issue. And also how might you turn kind of that issue or problem into a specific ask? And again, if you feel comfortable or have been kind of thinking about these issues, please type them in the chat and share as well. We'll be coming back to some of your ideas and asks later on. So now that we've talked about the general qualifications for an ask, I'm going to talk about some types of asks that work. Next slide, please. Oops, sorry. So here are a few categories of things you might want to ask for. The first is about a specific bill or amendment. And so this could be asking to someone to support, or it could be asking them to vote against a bill or an amendment. The second is in relation to funding or appropriations. So your ask could be for robust funding for a specific science agency or a program, or simply that they protect the current funding of an agency or program. The third type of ask is about supporting an issue or joining a caucus. As a reminder, so caucuses are kind of informal member organizations formed by members of Congress for the purpose of addressing a specific issue. And just to give you some examples, there's like a planetary science caucus, there's an oceans caucus, there's like an R&D caucus, there's a women in STEM caucus. There's really, especially in the House, if there's an issue or a cause, it's likely that the House has a caucus for it. In the Senate, they don't have as many caucuses. I believe they only have 30. So it's less of an opportunity in the Senate. And the fourth is the relationship ask, kind of, that use me as a resource. And don't overlook this one. Relationships are very valuable. You might be asking, how do I make this specific? And you could do that by maybe asking your legislator to visit your lab, or asking the member to speak at an event, or invite a staffer to an event, or to your lab. And so now that I've run through the types of asks that work, I want you to identify kind of what category does your ask fall into that? And if you're not sure, we can talk about that definitely during the Q&A as well. So next slide, please. Now that we've discussed what's an ask, what it looks like, let's talk about a couple of factors that will make your ask ineffective. So the first is, do not ask a policymaker for something that's out of line with their stated positions or previous actions. Kind of, don't expect them to do something that might be out of character for them. And I want to clarify that I'm not telling you not to have hard conversations with policymakers or not try to persuade them to take action on issues you care about, but I encourage you to be thoughtful about your ask. And just to give you an example, so there's a member of Congress that has introduced a bill to eliminate the EPA. If I was to go into the office and ask them to increase the EPA budget by 10%, that's kind of a wasted meeting with the office. My ask is so out of line with the office's position that they're not really going to take me seriously. And engaging policymakers is all about building relationships. And building relationships is critical because you want to become a trusted source for the office. So, during, I had an oral session the other night, and someone said, they had this quote from a policymaker that said, "It's not that I don't trust the science, it's that I don't trust the scientist." So although this might seem illogical, this is why building trust with policymakers is so critical. So, going back to my example, I might not be able to ask the legislator for a 10% increase for EPA, but maybe I can ask them to visit my lab that is cleaning up the local lake through funding I receive from EPA. And then maybe next time I engage with them, I can ask them to speak out in support of a clean water program at EPA that's, doing good work in my community. So again, it's not, sometimes, you'll have to be a little subtler and maybe not as direct as you would like to be with your ask, but that's not to say that you can't really have the conversation that you want to have. And also, don't ask your policymakers procedurally impossible tasks. And here are a couple of examples. So although Congress has oversight power over federal agencies, they cannot unilaterally tell agencies what to do. And outside of the appropriations process, federal legislators cannot ensure funding for a project or program. So this is where you might need to do your homework and figure out which branch and level of government has the power over the issues that you want to talk about. And finally, no untimely requests. Excuse me. Generally speaking, you want your policymaker to be able to act on your ask right away or in the near future. If your ask will not be actionable until the future, then you'll need to remind them. That's happened to me every time I've had to present. Next slide, please. So this is about really, don't forget to tailor your ask to the office. For example, you might have a different ask for an office that's a champion on the issue and one for an office that hasn't taken a position on the issue yet. Think about your resume and your cover letter. It can be very similar, but you really want to tailor it to your audience. In the next section, Stephen will talk more about researching your member of Congress, which will help you come up with an ask that creates a win-win situation for you and the policymaker. Next slide, please. As I presented, we've been walking through the Ask worksheet. So I'd love to hear if any of you guys would be willing to share some of the asks that you have for your legislators, or also take any questions that you might have. We have a couple of minutes for questions, which hopefully you've been thinking about. Oh, so Susan wants to talk about the Green New Deal. That's a great one, Susan. Does anyone else have any other issues they want to talk about, or any asks that they are contemplating? Okay, maybe you guys still need a moment to think. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen. Oh, we have one question. Do you recommend trying to get to know one legislator or bringing your issue to multiple legislator offices? Given that, again, it's one legislator can't do it all, unfortunately, I would definitely recommend bringing your issues to multiple legislators and offices. Because a lot of times what you're trying to do is find a champion for your issue or your ask, and that's really gonna really require consensus, especially in the House. Additionally, too, I would just say in a democracy, definitely the more people who are on your side and supporting and championing your issue, the better. If we have an issue we're passionate about, how can we determine whether there are specific bills that relate to the issue? Yeah, I would say that can be really hard, Sarah. So I will say my best advice is, one, you could reach out to us as AGU. Because I lobby Congress on behalf of AGU Sciences and our members. And also we just have kind of the resources and also the know-how to kind of help you tailor that ask. But I would also say, Stephen's going to talk about this on the next slide, but congress.gov is a great resource as well, or I believe it's GovTrack. And you can really just you can Google phrases like climate change or like STEM education and see what kind of bills pop up. But I would say another good source for that as well, in addition to kind of government relations, any science societies that you belong to, is also figure out which committee oversees your issue. So for a lot of science issues, that's going to be like the House Science Committee, and look to see what they're working on, because that will give you a good sense of legislation that's actually moving, if you will. And that can be important because I believe in this Congress, the House introduced 7,000 bills, but Congress, is only going to pass about 1% of those bills. But if the Committee of Jurisdiction, so House Science Committee in this instance, is actually working on the bill, you can kind of get a sense of, okay, I really care about this issue. So how can I also be advocating for a bill that's moving? And that just makes your life a little easier. But I would say check out your resources first. And again, I mentioned AGU, but also if you're at a university, or an institution, they probably have a government relations person who can help you as well. Not seeing any other questions. Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Brittany. Could we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so as Brittany said, some of the most effective asks are tailored to your specific Congress member. So in order to do that, we need to do a lot of research before you actually go in. So in customizing both your ask and your message, which Caitlin will talk about in a little bit, some initial things to start thinking about are, how does my work impact the state or district? So how is what I do as a scientist or as a science advocate relevant to my Congress member? And then what are my legislators' values and what are my legislators' interests? So you want to be thinking about what are kind of the things that actually motivate my Congress member to take action. So digging a little deeper still, what specific things about your Congress member are you looking for? Next slide, please. So some of the places to find common ground for your message and ask are your geographic region. So what is unique about your state or district that makes your advocacy relevant? So is it something physically unique? So are you on a coast? So coastline preservation is important, or are you is your district prone to wildfires or earthquakes? Or is it about what's in your district? Are there universities? Are there military bases? Are there scientific facilities like a telescope? These are all things that are very important to members of Congress and are likely to act on to support. You also want to be thinking about what committees your member sits on in Congress. As kind of Brittany alluded to, the committees can tell you what your member of Congress has the power to do. If they sit on a science committee, they could authorize specific projects. If they sit in appropriations committees, they can push for money to go to NSF or NOAA or USGS. Even if your message isn't directly related to a specific committee, these committees can give a window into also where the Congress members' interests and values lie. So you can still kind of frame whatever you want to talk about in terms of kind of what their priorities are. Another thing to remember in terms of committees is that members will tend to stay on committees so that they can build up seniority and expertise. So if you're advocating for something specific to this person's committee, you have that's a good opportunity to kind of build an ongoing relationship where you can continue to advise this person as they continue to build expertise on this topic. You also want to be thinking about what legislation your Congress member has introduced, co-sponsored, supported. This gives a window into what your legislator is likely to support, and can also be used as a framing. So if whatever you're advocating for builds on something they've previously done, you can say, you supported this one bill in the last Congress. This bill I'd like you to co-sponsor now builds on the steps that bill took and moves farther into the future. Other things you can be thinking about is what's your Congress member's former occupation. So did they come from the sciences, or were they an educator, lawyer, business person? This can tell you how to frame your message so that they understand it, what language you use, and kind of what outcomes you think are going to speak to them. You also want to be thinking about what caucuses your legislator belongs to, as Brittany said. So like the committees, this can tell you where your Congress member's interests and values lie. And oftentimes, since legislators can't be on every committee, they will join caucuses to show support for a specific issue. So if they are a member of a caucus that's relevant to the issue you're advocating for, this is likely going to be a person who is going to be willing to listen to what you have to say. And finally, what specific constituent priorities are unique to your state and district? So what do the constituents actually care about in your legislator's district is really important, because obviously they serve you ultimately. If your fellow constituents care about natural hazards or pollution, scientific funding, specific aspects of the economy, all these things can help you frame your message and ask to make it as relevant as possible to your Congress member. So this is a lot of information, a lot of things to find out. Where do you find all of this? Next slide, please. As Brittany kind of alluded to, there are a lot of great resources. Good place to start would be the legislator's actual website. So it's typically lastname.house or .senate.gov for federal legislators. You can also find the legislation and voting records on congress.gov or govtrack.us. Their social media is also a great place to see kind of what they care about, because whatever they're engaging with or speaking on is likely something that's important to them. And finally, as Brittany also said, whoever your government relation folks are, either at the university or with a professional society like AGU, we are doing this kind of all the time, so we can be a really great resource to help you make your advocacy successful. So next slide, please. So we have another worksheet that can help you navigate this step of researching. So Brittany just dropped it in the chat again. So if you want to take a quick look at the worksheet, you'll see space for basically listing out all these things we talked about. So basic info on the policymaker, office, party, how long they've been in office, how close their elections have been, which will give you kind of a top level view of where their priorities lie. Then personal information, kind of where they're coming from, how you can best connect with them, committees and relevant caucuses, again, what their power is, where their interests lie. And then 3 issues they list. Most of their websites will list a whole suite of issues that that are priorities for their office. You know, you can pick 3 issues that are relevant to whatever you're trying to go in to ask about. And then the next line is, you know, positions on the most relevant issue to what you're advocating for. So as Brittany said, it's not important just to know kind of what they care about, but you need to know what they're thinking about it as to, what their position is, so that you're not asking them something that's completely unreasonable, and you're framing your message in terms of what they kind of believe. You want to be thinking about possible shared interests. So this goes towards building that relationship and trust, and also something you can thank the policymaker for. This is another kind of helpful tool, looking back to what they've done in the past, to build trust and common ground between you and this policymaker, looking back to things that you appreciate in their record already. So now that you know you have a sense of the things you're looking for, let me talk briefly about kind of what I've done in the past to see what this looks like in real life. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So during my time in graduate school, I took some specific advocacy actions. I met with staffers on behalf of the American Physical Society, my professional society at the time, to advocate for 2 bills seeking to expand diversity and inclusion in science. So these are the Combating Sexual Harassment in Science Act and the Keep STEM Talent Act, which would make it easier for scientists to travel to the US to study and work. So I advocated to the staffs of Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who is my congresswoman where I worked in Connecticut, and Senator Chuck Schumer, who's senator for where I live in New York. So when presenting these bills to Congresswoman DeLauro, I was thinking about something specific to her district, which is there's a high academic presence. There's a lot of universities, a lot of research, and she's also been a longtime champion of biomedical research. So when talking about these bills, I was talking specifically about what they would mean for science and protecting the scientific workforce. And fortunately, this was these first one was productive meeting. We got Congresswoman DeLauro to co-sponsor the Combating Sexual Harassment in Science Act. I also took the Keep STEM Talent Act to Senator Schumer, who is a unique case, which highlights the importance of researching your policymaker. Senator Schumer is the Senate Minority Leader, so the top Senate Democrat. So in addition to just advocating for his constituents, he's responsible for strategy for the entire Democratic Party in the Senate. So in taking this meeting, we framed it in terms of kind of broad Democratic Party priorities, trying to bring as many strong science minds to participate in US research as possible, and also referencing the high academic presence also in New York State. So his leadership position also framed our ask, recognizing that as Senate Minority Leader, he was unlikely to co-sponsor a bill. We simply asked for support, and particularly highlighted that this bill would likely make most sense in comprehensive immigration package sometime in the future. So really what we wanted his office to do was keep these specific actions in mind to roll into a bigger package when the time comes. So wrapping up, these are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about when you're researching your Congress member. How is my issue or my background relevant to them? And how do I make a connection with them based on whatever common ground we have? So with that, I'll pass it off to Caitlin, who will speak about how you actually craft that message based on the research you've done.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. You want to move to the next slide? So let's put all of this together. So Brittany talked about what you want, Stephen talked about who you want to get it from, and now we're going to talk about how you get it. So next slide. So understanding your audience is critical to communicating effectively. So it's important that you understand your own goals as well as your audience's goals, your audience's demographics, and your audience's values, interests, and concerns. So this goes into what Stephen was saying. Next slide. So we all know in this room that science is important, but it's really your responsibility to explicitly show how your work is related to whoever you're delivering your message to, what they care about. So let's break each of these things down. So it's important that your message includes how your work impacts the state or the district. It reflects your legislator's values, and it shows the story behind your science. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more depth. Next slide. So how does your work impact your district? As much as possible, you want to aim at connecting your work with the state and the district. If you work for a university, how does your university stimulate your area's economy and bring in constituents? Do you bring a particular value to your geographic region with your research? You want to try to make this as specific as possible. So just a tip here for all of you working at universities or national labs, these are typically the crown jewels of a state or a district. These lawmakers love to hear from folks from these universities because of all of the jobs and economic stimulus they bring to a community. So trying to tie in your work at a university to your community is a really, really great way to bring your message across. Next slide. So as we talked about with the researching a member of Congress, knowing your audience is really important. So as Stephen mentioned, knowing someone's committees, what their voting record are all key in deciding how you frame your message. So your ask might be the same, but your message will be different, and who you're talking to really changes how you're going to ask for what you want. Next slide. So last part of this is telling a story. So we have a whole workshop next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern, I believe, talking about storytelling specifically, but we'll go over it briefly here. So our brains respond best to storytelling. People don't typically remember strict facts or figures if they don't have any meaning behind them. So telling a story helps focus people's attention, it improves their memories, it connects their emotions, and it increases trust. Again, we're going to talk about this in depth at our workshop next week, so I hope you all can join us in that if this is something that's interesting to you. Next slide. It's important when we're thinking about our message to watch our words. It's a common misconception that scientists need to dumb down our research when we're explaining to non-scientific audiences, but we really don't have to. We just need to think about our work in clear and concise terms. The best way that I can think to frame this is talk about your science the way that you would talk to a fifth grader. I volunteer at a museum and I often speak with children, and I never want to talk down to the kids or make science feel unapproachable to them. I just try to think about the science that I'm talking to in terms or concepts that they might be familiar with. It's wrong to assume that someone is incapable of understanding your work, and it's perfectly fine to ask someone in a meeting, no matter who they are, when you're talking with someone, are you familiar with X concept, and then build from there. Next slide. Along those lines, it's also important to avoid jargon in order to communicate effectively. I think all of us in all of our respective fields are guilty of using jargon. In DC, we have a lot of acronyms that we use for different things, and those acronyms change depending on if you're working more with Congress or more with federal agencies. So making sure you're avoiding acronyms and avoiding jargon, trying to use unambiguous words when you're discussing your science. We have here these slides that are some common words that have two meanings that don't really seem like they are jargon, but especially in a lot of our research thinking about a mean, dating, modeling, these all have different meanings when you're talking to the broader public than if you're discussing research. So if you're ever unsure about how a message might come across, it's a great practice to talk to your friends and family or someone who's maybe not in your scientific field to run by them if you're not sure a word feels jargony or not. So next slide, we're going to start talking about some messaging development tips. So it's important when you're developing your message to emphasize the value of your work. So an example here is if I studied coronal mass ejections in other space weather, it's not something that I would just go into a congressional office and say, this is what I do. I would say maybe that, but the research that I and others do on conditions on the sun help predict and prepare for major power grid outages that disconnect our satellites and weather and GPS. So making sure that you are tying what you're doing to its value and what its purpose is and what your research is used for. Next slide. A great tip here is to use social math. So if I were a volcanologist and I'm talking about a volcano that I study, talking about how a volcano oozes around 80,000 cubic meters or 3 million cubic feet of mud each day. 80,000 cubic meters doesn't really mean anything to most people, but if you apply social math to that, if you want to go ahead and click, Cheyenne, I can say that a volcano spews 80,000 cubic meters of mud each day, which is equivalent to about 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So putting social math in there really helps your audience to visualize what you're talking about and make your work more tangible. Next slide. So we have some resources here to make some of those conversions for you. So I wouldn't expect any of you to know that 80,000 cubic meters is the equivalent of 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So there's lots of great websites out there to make some of those conversions for you if you do have some bigger math numbers included in your research that you want to make a little more tangible. So Measure of Things is a great website to do this. Gettingthepicture.info is another great way. So I really encourage you, if your research is numbers heavy, to start to think about incorporating some of the social math into your messaging. Next slide. So we want to be brief, but not too brief. So if I said, I study the Pine Island Glacier, it doesn't really mean anything. That's not really super helpful. But if I say, I study the Pine Island Glacier, which is the fastest mountain glacier in Antarctica, responsible for about a quarter of Antarctica's ice loss thus far, that really is much more meaningful. So we really encourage not rambling on in your work and not getting too technical in what you're doing, but trying to come up with a concise way to talk about what you do is really important. Next slide. Finally, it's important to give examples related to people's lives. So if I'm researching the Chesapeake Bay, which is a watershed near Washington, D.C., saying we're seeing an increase in the abundance of invasive species in the Chesapeake Bay. So that's great, but why is that important? So saying when X and Y species invade the bay, they push out blue crabs, which provide so much money to the Maryland and Delaware economies each year. So if you've ever spent time in Washington, D.C. or in Maryland, you know that we love crabs. So talking about how an invasive species might impact something that is really critical to your local economy is really important. I also would encourage in general, going back to sort of the first tip on here, if you can put a dollar value on your research or the value of your work, I think that can be really helpful. So next slide, we have another worksheet. So this is just a way for you to jot down your research, going through what I just talked about. So talking about your research in 3 sentences or less, trying to come up with a good analogy or social math, and thinking about how you can relate your work back to your policymaker. So if anyone has any questions about messaging, I'll give folks a minute. As I said, we'll have some dedicated question time at the end too, but we just have one more brief topic, which is controversial topics before we get to the big Q&A. So I'll give folks just a second. Okay, let's give everyone some time to think about questions and let's talk about controversial topics. So next slide, Cheyenne. Okay, so what do you do when you are maybe meeting with an office that is not friendly to research, or what are you doing? So unreceptive audiences. One piece of good news is that in many ways your approach is the same. So it's building your message. It's all about understanding the listener and finding out what to connect with them on. So again, it's thinking about what their values are and what their interests are, and which of those interests you share and you can build upon, and how you can shape your talk about those themes. So I think the most likely unreceptive audiences that we are to have are offices that might not, or policymakers that might not be accepting of climate change science. So this is one of my favorite examples. This happened right when I moved to Washington, D.C. So in March of 2015 in DC, we had an unusual snowfall. And this is Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma. He's a Republican. He brought a snowball that he took off of the Capitol lawn onto the Senate floor and said, 2014 was the warmest year on record. It is still very, very cold out and very unseasonably cold. So this, I think, just shows maybe a misunderstanding of what climate change might be. And if you are a constituent, I think going into these offices and thinking about how you can frame or change the minds of some of these things is intimidating, but it's definitely not impossible. So next slide. Again, it's all about how you frame your messaging. In general, personal is more powerful. So if you're thinking about thinking about climate change, linking it to public health or individual health is a little bit more effective than talking about climate in terms of polar bears. So a good example we have of this is in 2015, the Obama administration had released their Clean Power Plan, which would require states to dramatically cut their emissions. Of course, reducing emissions can help improve air quality and reduce the impacts of climate change. So when the administration was workshopping how they wanted to message this, they thought about it in a couple of different ways. So do we talk about reducing emissions to impact climate change and saving the polar bears, or do we talk about reducing emissions to improve air quality and help kids with asthma? So the children, of course, won out talking about reducing emissions to help asthma in general populations was better messaging. So again, putting a more personal spin on it, putting a more human element to your research is something that is always really helpful in dealing with some of these less receptive audiences. Next slide. So anticipation and preparation are key. So if you're preparing for a meeting or getting ready to speak on a panel, talking to a reporter, or any situation where you think you might get some contentious questions or remarks, our advice is just to prepare your messages in advance. Try to anticipate what might be contentious. So really play your own devil's advocate in what you're doing, and avoid negative statements about other people's research and work. So if you're going into a congressional meeting, especially, that meeting is really about you and your time, and it's best to focus on your asks and your message for what you want to talk about. So sort of spending some time thinking about preparing these in advance will really make it easier in the moment. Next slide. Another strategy, if you find yourself in something that you're worried might become a little bit contentious, is to always return to your main message. So having your messages prepared out in advance is really helpful so that you always know to bring things back to your main points, instead of steeping yourself into deeper controversy. I think you don't want to try to get caught in a gotcha moment. That's why, again, this preparing is really helpful, and having some transition statements at the ready is a really great way to do this. So next slide. So practicing these transition statements is really great. So some ways you can prepare this are someone's asking you something that seems to be leading in a different direction, saying, I see where you're going with that, but what's really important here is whatever your focus is. Do you want to click through these, Cheyenne? I think there's 3 clicks to go through. Or that's not my particular field or of expertise, but here's what I can tell you. Or that wasn't the focus of our research, but here is what we found. all of this to say, I think if you're in a congressional meeting, it's unlikely that anyone will try to pick a fight with you. It's not really a good use of anybody's time to go into these. And I think a lot of these meetings, particularly with constituents, the staffers are really eager and excited to hear from constituents. But if you do ever get asked a question that you don't know the answer to, there is absolutely nothing wrong with saying that you don't know and that you will get back to them. It's also a really good excuse to follow up with the office and continue building that relationship. Next slide. All in all, it's really up to you as the person asking for something to explicitly show who you're meeting with, how supporting your issue also supports the values of their constituents. So especially offices on Capitol Hill meet with dozens of people a week. So it's really about what you can do to build your relationship and make yourself memorable to these offices and how you can do that. So with that, I think we are ready to take some questions. Okay, I see one question from Susan here. How do you recommend talking with a legislator who publicly makes comments that are incorrect in terms of the science? Brittany, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, give me all the hard questions. Yeah, so Susan, I think what I would do, honestly, is I probably would come in and never actually address the fact that they're talking about it incorrectly, but just talk to them correctly and kind of do everything, all the other things that we've been saying. Yeah, I think I would just honestly pretend that they haven't said that, and just kind of and talk about it correctly. In some ways, I think if you just to be very frank, I think it takes a certain amount of ego to run for office. And so I think that, if you're talking long term and really trying to get the policymaker to be correct on the science, I would say I probably wouldn't address that they said anything incorrect. I would just go in and talk about the science accurately. I think if you were to go in and try to, especially if I'm assuming kind of underlying your question is the sense that maybe they're maliciously incorrectly talking about the science or not coming from a good place when they're incorrectly talking about the science, I wouldn't address that, because I think if you address that, I think that it kind of would set your relationship off on not a great foot. So I would just go in and kind of gently talk to them about the science in an accurate way, and just try to get them, I think, do a lot of like educating about the science and why it's really in their best interest to be, considering and accurately and not accurately taking into account the science for their work. That's my best advice. Caitlin, I don't know if you have more to add.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in general, going into some of these meetings you might anticipate to be contentious, I think going in, approaching a topic in good faith is really important. So like not coming in with sort of going in and understanding where they might be coming from to sort of frame your message, but not going in and assuming that they'll never give you what you want. I mean, I've taken meetings before that I expect to just be a couple of minutes, and then it ends up being, I think we had one meeting where they asked us like 40 minutes of questions about the research and about what we were doing. So I think even if you expect an office might not be supportive of the research that you're doing, you can definitely be pleasantly surprised and they'll be inquisitive. Okay, so the next question is, can you talk about how visits and meetings are working in a virtual space? How does one go about setting up meetings? So this is from Sarah. Meetings are still happening in a virtual space. So you go about setting them up basically the same way that you would set them up before. So you can call or email your policymaker and say, I would like to meet with my representative about XYZ issue. Is there a time to set up? So typically these meetings are happening with staffers. So you'll set up a time to talk to a staffer. They're either over, I don't know, Zoom or Teams video. I will say none of my friends who are Capitol Hill staffers ever have their video on because they're all excited to not have to wear a suit all the time. So they're typically in their sweats like the rest of us. But they're largely happening the same. I will say that AGU has had a couple of virtual advocacy days throughout the year. So we did a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advocacy Day in June, and then a Climate Science Advocacy Day in October, where we set up some asks, and we had a couple of bills and pieces of legislation that we have supported as an organization that we recommended for folks to meet with their policymakers about. So if you've never met with your member of Congress, I think this is actually a really good time to start because you can just do it from your home. And joining one of those advocacy days is a good way to sort of have some of those asks pre-set up. If you don't have any to think of, it will put you in a group of people who are either from your state or from your region to talk with. Yeah, hope that helps. And if you ever want help setting up a meeting, our staff at AGU is very happy to help you do that as well, because we have access to contact lists and have relationships with lots of offices on the Hill, so we can set those meetings up with you. Thanks.
So Caitlin, I actually have a question while we wait for more people to
great.
Type theirs into the chat. So a lot of what we talked about today was still kind of directly in terms of US government. Could you speak to how transferable some of these practices are to engaging policymakers outside of the US?
I think almost everything would work outside the US. So I think coming up with an ask, tailoring your ask to who you're talking with, the researching your policymaker, I think at both internationally and at a local government level, I think those are pretty easily transferable between. If it's something like maybe a local policymaker, they might not have as strong of an online presence, but being able to just do a cursory Google search to either find their social media, find their campaign website, to sort of see some of those issues that they care about. But yeah, I think for folks outside the US, I think those, the worksheets that we provided still should be useful. But if anybody hits roadblocks, please feel free to reach out to us, and we are happy to help. We are definitely working to build our international presence at AGU. So we are happy to work with you to do that. Good question, Stephen.
Yeah, I definitely say we've also had some international science policy sessions at AGU fall meeting, which are great.
Yes.
So I encourage anyone interested in that to check that out. And I think we've had one this week already, and one of the messages that came across there was the goal of trying to find common ground and trying to kind of listen to where policymakers are coming from is universal, a good universal practice to connecting with policymakers. So
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Brittany dropped in the chat here to, this is a great point. So crafting a one-pager is a really useful tool to have when you're meeting with your legislator, and we have a handy one-pager worksheet. So one-pager is just basically your ask, your research, and some nice visual graphics all in a single page. So you can send it to your policymaker before you're having a meeting with them, so that they can see your research and your ask sort of visually summarized. We did a webinar earlier this year too on building a one-pager. So if you don't have one, or you don't really know what it is, but having a visual representation of your research sound interesting to you, I would definitely encourage you to look at this worksheet and look back at that webinar. It is on our YouTube channel. I think Brittany said in the webinar, if you can build a scientific poster, you can build a one-pager.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And there's some also just some great resources for this on our broader Sharing Science Initiatives AGU Connect page as well. Seeing no more questions, we'll kind of go into our wrap up. So Cheyenne, if you'll click to the next slide. Yeah, so the next workshop in our series, as Caitlin mentioned, is the Storytelling for Policymakers workshop, which is going to be on the 16th, so 7 to 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, or 10 a.m. if you're like us on the East Coast. And the first one in this series was the Science Policy 101. We also have lots of other science policy events throughout the week. Next slide, please. And we just also wanted to share, for those of you who are really interested in science policy and want to, maybe start working or looking for more opportunities in this space, we are currently taking applications for both our Congressional Science Fellowship, where you get to work for a member of Congress for a year, as well as our Voices for Science program, where we challenge scientists or AGU members. You don't necessarily have to be a scientist. We have some educators as well and some other folks. And we challenge them to take at least one science policy or science communication or outreach action per month. So there's both a science policy and a science communication track. And we start with a kickoff workshop sometime this spring. And then you also have monthly chaperones with your AGU liaison. And so this will be our 4th year, I believe. Time is slipping by. But it's a really great program. And I know, I think a lot of our community has really gotten a lot out of this program. So we're taking applications for both of those programs right now. And also we've had events about both of these programs as well. So if you're looking to find out more, you can look in the program for, I believe it's How to Become a Congressional Science Fellow. And then I'm not exactly sure of the title for the Voices for Science, but I feel like if you type in Voices for Science, you'll come up with it. And if you want to stay involved just with the AGU Science Policy team in general, we encourage you to sign up for our monthly science policy alerts. It's where we advertise every single one of our science policy opportunities, whether it's writing to your legislator about science funding or scientific integrity issues, or on hazards bills, our congressional visits days or virtual visits days. And yeah, every opportunity. And we also provide a little bit of information about kind of what's going on in the science policy world. So, and you can do it by just texting AGU to 52886. And one that's not on here because it just opened this week is we have a 3-month paid internship that we're looking for someone to start in January and hopefully be with us for the next 3 months. And if you go to the AGU jobs website, you'll see public affairs internship posted. And if Cheyenne, if we'll kind of double click, actually skip the next slide. And if you need anything after today or have any questions or want to know more about any of the opportunities that I just talked about, or if you find yourself meeting your legislators and you don't know what to do, or maybe testifying in front of Congress or maybe your local state house, please email us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. And sciencepolicy.agu.org is also our website address. And Bennett, yes, was one of our Voices for Science participants, and he's amazing, as all our Voices for Science are. But yeah, please stay in touch. We are here and we're a membership service. So if you're an AGU member, please, we're here for you. Thank you all so much. And yeah, please stay in touch and hope to see some of you at our storytelling workshop.